Welcome to the DIY Writer Show with the mild-mannered, slightly heroic host, Jeff Bacon.
This is Jeff Bacon with the DIY Writer Podcast, and today I'm with Frank Butterfield. Frank, how in the hell are you?
Well, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good. For those of you who haven't heard of Frank Butterfield, if you happen to look him up on Amazon, you'll notice he has 70-some books out there. He's got a ton of books. He is an animal when it comes to writing. So, Frank, let's talk about your latest project, man.
Well, I'm working on a historical fiction legal procedural that's set here in Daytona Beach, where I live, but it's set in 1948. It happens during the middle of Bike Week, which you may have heard of. It's the big deal that happens here every year. And 1948 was the first year that Bike Week really took off the way that it has been, at least up until last year.
Okay.
And it got covered in Life magazine, and it really is where it really found its footing. So I've got a couple of kind of gangs, although nobody would have used that word at the time. That's kind of a 50s word. But a couple of bike gangs who kind of rumble with each other, and one of them ends up dead. And so my main characters are a lawyer and his private investigator. And so it's kind of Perry Mason at the beach is what I like to call it. The lawyer is pretty new. He's youngish. He's like 30. He was in the JAG Corps in the Army during the war. So he doesn't have a lot of trial experience. So he's kind of thrown into the deep end. This is his third trial that involves a murder. And he's kind of single-handedly responsible, or seemingly, for the increased murder rate in Daytona Beach in the 40s. But he reads a lot of Perry Mason, and so he uses Perry as kind of like his guide. Although he has an older law partner that he who used to live in Daytona and came back, and so now they're working together. So he has a little bit of help. But the bottom line of this case is that the sheriff's deputies relied upon the wrong person for an ID. Now, this is during a time when, there was no photo ID. No, if you carried a driver's license, if your state did it, there would be a thumbprint on the driver's license, but there were no photographs. So they have a body, they have a guy holding a knife, and they get the wrong person to identify the body. And so the body is identified as person A, but it's really person B. And it turns out the guy holding the knife was not the killer. And we know pretty quickly who is the killer. The issue is, how is this going to work itself out through the courts? So this is my fifth book in this series, and it's the third trial. Two of the books were more about PI kind of stuff. What I wanted to do was, I realized after I'd written the third or fourth book that what I knew about the legal system here was very, very sketchy. And I spent a lot of time trying to see if I could find a trial transcript, even just like, what do you say when you walk into the courtroom, when the judge stands up and, sits down at the desk and the bailiff is like, court will come to order. Is that what they said? Because I can't find any evidence of it. The nice thing about Perry Mason is that how courts were working in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in California, because he was a lawyer. And so everything he wrote was accurate. Stretched, but accurate.
Right.
So what I basically did is I found another murder trial that happened here, that happened in 47, and basically wrote out everything I could find in the media or in the newspapers that had been written about the case, and basically tracked it to see if I could figure out how exactly all the processes worked. So I've got a pretty good idea of how it is now, and that's what I'm writing to. And I also wanted to make this book be kind of my template for future books in this series, so that even though I'm not going to have this detail probably about each individual case going forward, at least I know kind of where every case would be in any particular part of the process. I'm just about finished. I've been working on this book since March of last year, which is by it's 18 times longer than I've ever spent on any other book. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
Most books I write in about 3 weeks. And sometimes a little shorter, sometimes a little longer. But this one, just all the work I put into it's really eating my lunch. It's not like it's going to be 200,000 words. It'll probably be about 100, 120,000 at the most, which for this series is long. I like to keep this series to about between 70 and 90,000.
Okay.
Although, in other series, sometimes it's 45, sometimes it's 60, sometimes it's 120, but it runs around that. Just kind of depends on the subject. But this book I'm working on right now, I'm really excited to get out, and I really want to get it done within the next few days. I definitely want to make sure it's out before Bike Week of next year, should we have one. I don't know how that's going to be handled here yet, but anyway, so that's what I'm working on, and what I've been doing. I published. So yeah, you said I have 72, 73 titles published. In this year, I've been working on a series of holiday titles that are all basically every single holiday. They're short stories and novellas. So I've been doing that, and then I've been working on some of the other series, but I basically kind of realized I've taken this year off, more or less, because I'd worked really hard 16, 17, 18, and most of 19. And then I kind of slowed down. And when I get done with this book, I'm going to zoom back in to what I was the writing schedule that I was on before, where I'm trying to do 2 books a month.
Wow.
Once I get done with the short stories, which will be Boxing Day, will be the last one, which is the day after Christmas, then I'll be back to my regular schedule for sure. Well, that's the plan anyway.
That's the plan.
Yeah.
So have you found that COVID, the pandemic and everything, has that affected your writing at all, or?
No, actually, it's theoretically made it easier because I didn't realize I had been social distancing for the last 4 years. Until it's like, okay, stay at home, don't talk to anybody. I'm like, okay, so how is this different than normal? I mean, I do have some friends here in the area that I do hang out with, and where we do the things we need to do to take care of ourselves. But
right.
No, actually, what's mostly interrupted has been, because I'm a big political history junkie, I watched the impeachment, I watched the trial, I watched the election, and particularly with the impeachment and the trial, I wanted to watch those because it's something I'm very interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And so that took up some time, but mostly I kind of, during this period since like last March, I would say the only difference is that I'm not seeing other people as much as I was. So I actually have more time to write, but I haven't been really using it for writing. I've been using it more for either doing deep research or just futzing around.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's good. I know that some of the authors I talked to have just been crushed by it. They need that social interaction. Then when they don't get it, they're like, I don't know what to write. And plus just the stress of the situation is
right. Oh yeah,
taking its toll on people, and so on and so forth. I don't think the politics in this country has really helped anybody with creativity or anything like that, but I don't know. I don't know how that all works, but I think it's different for everybody. If you're already socially distancing and writing, then I suppose it wasn't that big of a stretch for you. So the biker that got bumped off, and you're talking about all this historical research that you need to do. What's the actual details of that case? I mean,
the real case?
Yeah, I mean, was there anything that there's a lot of times when I talk to authors and they do stuff like that, and they're like, you read the case and you're like, what the hell happened here? Is there anything that just kind of stuck out?
Well,
like, oh my God.
There's a couple of things. One was, so it happened here. It actually happened not in Daytona Beach, but in Holly Hill, which is the next town north.
Okay.
And the case was, there was a guy who worked for an ice truck delivery company, ice trucks that deliver ice for your ice box. And he had borrowed the truck from his boss for unknown reasons. and was kind of driving around kind of a backwoodsy area up in Holly Hill and stopping house to house to house for, he never really explains why he's doing it, why he did it. He was black and he was in a neighborhood that was all white because Holly Hill was originally a segregated town, specifically constructed that way. Although and I guess probably still in 47, it would have still been almost all white. So as he's like stopping, he's asking for water for his radiator or water for him to drink, or asking names of just doing random stuff. And he ends up at this one house and has an interaction with this woman. She's in the middle of baking peach pies, and he doesn't like her dog, and he ends up shooting her. And it's never really clear why. There's no, when the doctor, because there's no medical examiner at this point, this is before medical examiners in Florida. When the doctor examines her body, there was no assault. He just shot her. And he's black, she's white, she's young, she's pretty. So the newspapers love that.
Right.
Every headline is pretty Mrs. So-and-so murdered by black, or by Negro, not black.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah. But here's the thing. There are two specific things that happened in this case that are pretty interesting. The first is that, so in Florida, when someone is murdered, the coroner's jury meets. There's actually kind of three things. So there's a coroner's jury, 6 people. At this time would have been 6 men. In the paper, the coroner, who is also the justice of the peace, because again, this is before formalized medical examiners, basically is quoted in the paper as saying to the coroner's jury, look, we got to find this gun. We got to find who did it. So, and this is what he's quoted as saying. So I want you to knock on any door, go into any house. And when I read that, I was like, wait, whoa, what about the Fourth Amendment? And then I went back and did some research. This was before the Fourth Amendment was applied to states. So before the late 40s, the Fourth Amendment was considered only to be federal. It wasn't considered until the Supreme Court said, no, it actually applies to state actions as well. States had the leeway, unless they put in their own constitutions, to do things like just walk into a house and grab something. So I don't know, there's no detail after they figure out who did it, after they grab the guy and they get the gun and all that. There's no detail about what those jury people or jurymen would have done, but that part was interesting. The other part is that so the coroner's jury says, this guy murdered this woman, and then it goes to the grand jury, and the grand jury meets and says, okay, yes, they return a true bill of indictment, and there's like, yes, this man killed this woman. Right at the time, as the grand jury results are being presented to the court, and the judge is about to arraign the guy the perpetrator, suddenly in walks a lawyer from Miami who has been sent by the NAACP, and basically is like, hold on. And he convinces the judge to abate everything, and he files for to get a new grand jury seated that has actual black members. And to my surprise, the judge that I use as the judge in my books, who is a real person, Herbert Frederick, Judge Frederick agrees to this, and they do reseat the jury. And the paper, of course, is full of comments about how pissed off the county commissioners are to have to draw up a new list of people.
Yeah.
And there's this whole big thing where they call guy, because Daytona Beach was where most all black citizens in Volusia County, which is our county, lived. There's a lot of reasons for that, but so they basically called in leading black citizens to figure out who is, because they weren't recording race, so they didn't know who they had in their lists. Because in Volusia County, there was no poll tax at this point, and anybody could register to vote. Anybody who was had proof of citizenship or whatever they required. So they didn't know who were on the voter rolls who were black and who wasn't. So they called in people to figure out who that was, and they made sure they put those people in the hopper, and they ended up with a grand jury of 18 people, and one of them was black. But it was an improvement. It was the first time that it ever happened. So, or at least in modern history.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the grand jury still finds the guy that they return an indictment.
Yeah.
Then the actual jury is called. There are 3 in the pool, which is called a veneer. There are 3 black, and they're all men because women are not allowed to sit on juries yet.
Yeah.
So there are 3 men who are black who basically will not agree to the death penalty because it's a capital crime, and that's that's a typical thing that's been going on for a while. Where when they're doing voir dire, they ask, will you agree to the death penalty, and they say they won't, so they're dismissed. Anyway, the trial goes on. He's found guilty. Then that's appealed to the Supreme Court because there was no appellate division at the time. It goes to the Supreme Court, comes back, and then he's executed. The murder happened July 29th, and he's 47. He's executed February 3rd or 4th of 49, which at the time was a really long time. A really long time.
Really?
You could theoretically commit a crime on June 1st and be executed on September 1st, depending on how things went, because all the safeguards that are now put into that system didn't exist at the time.
Right.
So that was interesting, but also I wrote up my own little outline of all the things that happened and passed it around to different lawyers that I know. And it was interesting because I guess I was so much in the case, I was pretty convinced this guy did it. He was probably developmentally disabled, and he was also just kind of seemed to be very overwhelmed by the situation he was in. But every lawyer I handed it off to were like, this sounds like this guy got railroaded. And more than one of them said, so in Florida, for capital murder, there have to be aggravating circumstances to the crime, like burglary. There's no real, it's because we don't have the transcript. It's not clear what made this a capital crime, other than it could be he was there to steal something from her, but it's never really explicitly said in the papers that I could find. So that was one thing. But the other thing was there's so many weird little things that happen along the way that really reveal, and this is part of what I'm using for this book that I'm writing, that this was the end of the road. This was, Daytona Beach was one of the larger cities in Florida at the time, but it's still isolated from Tallahassee, the state capital.
Mm-hmm.
It's isolated from Miami. It's not easy to move around Florida at this point in time. If you're not taking the train, it's really hard to get anywhere because the roads are all small and narrow and not well developed like they are now. So the judges here were kind of on their own, and they kind of made things up to a certain extent as they went along. Like the whole precedent for throwing out the grand jury and reseating one, he doesn't, if there's a precedent for it, it's not mentioned in the paper. But there's a lot of little weird stuff that happens. One of the things, for example, is that the guy is moved around. He's never, ever, ever, except overnight a couple of times, kept in the jail in DeLand, which is the county seat. The jail is across the street from the courthouse, or the old jail is across the street from the old courthouse, so put it that way. He's never there. He's always somewhere else. Usually he's in Rayford, which is where that's the state penitentiary up near Jacksonville.
Okay.
And that's where they do executions. That's usually where they keep him. And they will occasionally bring him back to DeLand for his court trial, but not always. So the story is that the sheriff keeps saying, well, they don't want him to be lynched. But there hadn't been a lynching in Daytona Beach or in Volusia County in 20 years at that point.
Okay.
So it's just really, there's so many weird little things. I wish that I knew somebody who was alive from that time, who was an adult at that time, not a child, who could say, yeah, well, this is what was really going on. Because it's almost like when I did the research, I got the procedural stuff as much as I could get. but there's a lot of still open questions I have that I'm exploiting for plot purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm assuming that the judges, particularly Judge Frederick, I have met somebody who knew Judge Frederick, and what she said was that he was a terrible father. He had 4 daughters, and they all basically hated him. But that he was very fair. And in all the trials and all the stuff I've read about him, he does sound like he was very fair. But I'm assuming that some of his fairness was kind of like things that he came up with on his own, like throwing out a grand jury and reseating a new one,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't seem to have a precedent. Maybe it does that I don't know about. But so yeah, there's lots of little juicy things like that came up as a result of looking deeper into that particular trial.
Huh.
That I'm exploiting for this particular book, and because I know the duration of this series that I'm writing lasts until they live here until 58 or 57. I can't remember what year it is, before they basically kind of have to leave. So Judge Frederick will be around for a while because he was on the bench until 53 or so.
Okay.
So I got a lot of juicy stuff out of that, that I can use for future mayhem.
Very cool. So a lot of your books, are they basically based on, I mean, are you looking for historical things that you can bring into a fiction type mystery? Is that what you're trying to go for here?
Yeah, so in the main series that I write, which is the Nick Williams mysteries and adventures, basically when I would write any one of those books, what I do is I start off by reading the newspaper, see what I see. I kind of get an idea of where, because they're in order, and it's a series of adventures and mysteries and crimes and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to, and that's what I've done with these Daytona Beach books. I try to figure out what's going on around. For the Nick Williams stuff, because they're more cosmopolitan, I read like Life magazine, Time, National Geographic. I'll read the New York Times, the San Francisco papers, because it mostly takes place in San Francisco, and just try to get an idea of what's going on in the country or what's going on that might provide either a point of interest or something like that. I wrote a book that was set in 1960. Eisenhower is still president. I don't know if so it was 60. And there was which nobody will probably remember, but there was we were still sort of on the gold standard. We were on what was called the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the dollar and the pound were pegged to a certain formula. And what was happening was the dollar was getting stronger and stronger because the pound was falling. And so Nick is a billionaire at this point, or pretty close to one. And one of the things he's been doing to protect himself has been like sending a lot of money to Switzerland. And basically he's at the airport getting ready to fly to Rome for a funeral, really they're going to Capri for a funeral. And this guy from the Treasury Department stops him. It's like, we need to talk. You've got to stop sending all this money to Switzerland. You're actually messing up the balance of payments. And he's like, what are you even talking about? It's like, no, like we don't have enough gold to cover all the money you're sending. And he's like, okay, well, I won't do it anymore. And that little thing right there, that's a whole like maybe 10 pages. Mm-hmm. And it's a little technical, it's a little wonky, but it was a fun little thing to write about because in Life magazine that was published the week before this happens, there's a huge article about the concern that the army had about paying their soldiers in West Germany and France and Italy, the ones who were stationed abroad, and Spain, because they were not sure if they could send all the money they needed because they had to send it out of the US into France, Germany, or West Germany and Italy to pay the soldiers. Because it basically when they got paid, that money got moved out of the US economy and into these other economies, which affected the balance of payments. That now doesn't mean anything. Right. But then was a big, huge deal. And so I based it on that because there were people they were interviewing soldiers, and in particularly at the bases in West Germany, which are the really big ones, who were like, well, we don't know how we're going to buy groceries. Like, this is, if we don't get paid. It was a really, really big deal. And
Mhm.
of course, nobody now would really remember that, but I use that as kind of a little fun factoid for,
Well, that's not even something that would register with most people right now, because
right,
none of that exists.
right, exactly. Yeah, because fortunately, fortunately, because it sounds like a really good idea until you begin to look into it and you realize that there's a lack of flexibility in what the government can do. And so anyway, but yeah, that was a fun little part. In that same book, they go to Capri first, but then they find out that a friend of theirs is in a hospital in Salisbury, which is now uh, was the capital of Rhodesia at the time, Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. So
Mhm.
Salisbury is now called Harare. So they go down to Salisbury because they can do that. And I wrote this whole story about them walking around in in Salisbury, essentially trying to solve or to deal with a couple of different things, like how to get their friends out of there, and then running into, because basically Southern Rhodesia was the South Africa that South Africa could never really become.
Mhm.
They were more, it was more intense. It wasn't as regulated as South Africa was doing, but it was much more intense. And it's a very interesting, very kind of sad story to write, but a very interesting one. And the friend of theirs who's in the hospital, and anybody who read the story who knows anything about AIDS knows that what he basically died of was a proto-AIDS, like an earlier version of HIV,
I
because he'd been,
a proto AIDS. I guess I don't know about that. So what?
well, so here's the thing. The virus HIV comes from uh, the area of the Congo that's centered around Kinshasa, which is the capital of the Congo. In a previous story, Nick and Carter, those are my main characters, had lived in Leopoldville, which is the old name of Kinshasa
Okay.
for reasons. And they have a friend there who is, when the Belgian Congo becomes the Congo, there's this big everything kind of goes to hell in a handbasket, because the Belgians did a terrible job handing over everything and did not prepare the Congolese for anything. There were like 18 college graduates in the entire country. That's how bad it was.
Okay.
And the Belgians just were like, okay, you want to be independent? We'll leave. Bye. Just like that. And it didn't go well. So this character, he ends up like basically walking from the Congo down to Southern Rhodesia, which is theoretically probably not possible, but that was part of the story.
Right.
Along the way, he picks up a disease. And by the time he gets to Salisbury, he's like shaking and like can't eat anything and has lost a lot of weight. And HIV in, I think it was in 2003 or 4, they realized that it had come from, there were tissue samples from hospitals in Leopoldville where people had the predecessor disease to HIV. Sometimes I think it's called HIV-1 or HIV-0. I can't remember how it's called. And so that's what this guy does from. And anybody who, because most of my audience are gay men of a certain age, older than me usually, who did live through AIDS. So all of the symptoms and the things that happened to him, anybody reading it would know, oh, that's what that is. It's something having to do with HIV. So that'll be, of course, then a little, and I do this a lot because I know the time frame that I'm writing these books through. So I leave little kind of Easter eggs, although that's not probably not the right word for this, but I leave little things behind in some of the old books that then I'm going to pick up in future books.
Sure.
One of which, by the way, I want to talk about for just real quick.
Yeah.
In the first short story that I wrote in the holiday series was New Year's Day, 1979. And so the short stories are all Nick and Carter. And they're, like I said, they're billionaires. They own all this stuff, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So it gives me a lot of leeway to write about a lot of things. So they've opened up a hotel in Dallas, which is actually, I based it on a real hotel that's off of I-35 that's had a lot of different names, but I was trying to hope I could remember the name of it. Anyway, it has a pyramid top. So anybody who lives in Dallas will know what that is.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so they own this hotel, and they opened it, and they decide to have a fundraising New Year's Eve party. And it's like 100 gay men paying $100 each, something like that. So they're having this party, and of course it's 1979 and it's Dallas. The cocaine is everywhere. That's basically what everybody's doing.
Okay.
So there's this they kind of figure out or Nick figures out who the dealer is, and he manages to basically force him to leave Dallas and go to Brazil. He pays him basically to leave town.
Okay.
So that's where the story ends. So I've gotten reviews where people are like, this is outrageous. Like, there's no penalty for this dealer. And I want to say, like, I don't think you understand what's going to happen. That's January 1, 1979, when the adventure, because when the series that I'm working on right now with Nick and Carter gets to January of 79, guess where they're going? As soon as they get out of Dallas, they're going to Rio, because they're going to go chase down these guys and they're going to deliver justice. And like, so, but I haven't said that to any, I haven't said that in writing, but I've mentioned it a couple of times in interviews, because it's one of the most interesting things about these stories is that I'm writing basically this big, long epic about these two guys and what happens from 1953 to 2008.
Okay.
And so just because something doesn't resolve itself in one book doesn't mean that story is over. It may be just the beginning of a much longer saga,
So you're writing about these two guys from 1953 to 2008, and you're on 1980.
No, actually, in their series, I'm in 1970. They're in the middle of Nick owns a movie company and a TV production studio, and he's in the middle of having to produce a TV series, and which is also that's been on hold for a while.
Yeah.
But which is a lot of fun writing about that, particularly 1970 TV.
Yeah.
The woman who is the star of the show is a Black woman who is kind of Diane Carroll. I don't know. Do you know the series Julia? Diane Carroll's TV show?
Yep. Your microphone cut out. Frank. Go.
So there's this TV show that he's producing, and it's basically this woman is kind of like Diane Carroll, but a little bit further down the line. So she's not a nurse. She actually owns her own company. Part of the story is that he has a little trouble selling it to the network, and because they think it's a little too advanced. So he ends up putting in syndication. I have a series that's set in current time where this series is talked about, where there's this one guy who's white is talking to a guy who's Black, and it's like, have you ever heard of this show called Touch of Rouge? And he's like, oh, my mother loved that TV show, and I have it on DVD, and it's amazing. And oh my God, blah, blah, blah. There were only 12 episodes or 14 episodes, but people love that show, and it's like, it's mythical kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that interconnection. So Nick and Carter, in terms of the series that they sit in the middle of, they're in 1970. They're in February, and they'll be in 1970 for a while, I think, and then they'll move forward. So we have all sorts of things to cover historically. We've got Harvey Milk being elected to the Board of Supervisors and then being assassinated. Yeah. And then we've got the AIDS crisis. And then we end with, basically the books end with marriage equality, with the marriages that happened in June of 2008 in San Francisco. And that's where the story is. Or that's where Nick and Carter's story ends.
Okay. So. Huh. Yeah, I didn't make that connection when you said 2008. I'm like,
yeah, those marriages were the one that Prop 8 was designed to invalidate.
Okay.
So they're the one, and there was a big, huge, gigantic, that was a big event in San Francisco when it happened.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I was just sitting there, 1953 to 2008. Why in the hell would he stop at 2008? Got
That's
it.
why.
All right.
They call one of the sort of the things about the story is they call each other husbands from 1953. And then they have these, as time goes by, they keep having these conversations with each other about, will we ever be able to get married? Do you think that'll ever be possible?
Mhm.
And, you know, and they, in the 50s, of course, a la the Jetsons, they say things like, yeah, well, we'll get married on Mars and we'll honeymoon on Venus, you know, because assuming that like by, you know, the time marriage equality happens, that we'd be living on Mars or whatever, you know, because everybody in the 50s thought that, you know.
Yeah.
But
they actually had a space program starting up. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, that's one of the things I love about all this stuff is I get to play back and forth at the time and how things are interacting with each other and series that are interconnected, because the Daytona Beach series, the two guys, Tom and Ronnie, they end up working for Nick and Carter after they leave Daytona Beach and they move to Fort Lauderdale. So, and they show up in they've shown up in two different books, two different Nick and Carter books set in the 60s.
That's very interesting. So do you, you know, it's almost impossible to take a look at every book that you have here and discuss it because we'd be here till Friday. I mean, but I like the way that you I really like the way that you're interweaving everything. That's very interesting to me. So you have this well plotted out.
No, I have no plotting whatsoever.
What?
No.
What are you coming out? I mean, this is just coming out of the back recesses of your mind.
Yeah.
How this is going to work out?
I just said, well, the 2008 I know because after I'd written the second book, I was like, I do need to know where this is going. So I sat down and wrote a short story about what happens the day they get married. 3 days later, after I'd stopped crying, and I'm not kidding, there was something about that was just really intense emotionally. I realized, okay, nobody else can see this. I have to kind of file it away. And I've gone back and rewritten it because some of what I wrote at that time no longer would apply because the way the story's evolved. But there's the short story that I wrote that's set in 2006 is Veterans Day.
Okay.
And that in that short story, if you really want to know kind of what has happened, there's enough hints in that if you've read all the other books, that Veterans Day story has a lot of hints about what's coming and also what has happened up to that point.
Okay.
For one thing, they mostly outlive all their contemporaries.
Yeah.
Some because of AIDS and some just because
life.
Yeah, right. We know when they passed away because of the contemporary series. And I had a couple of people come to me and be like, they're so rich, they should be able to live forever. And I'm like, no, money doesn't really do that. That's a nice thought, but it doesn't really work that way. Lots of people die young who are wealthy. But so, yeah, I love the interplay too. And I love the fact that there's this big universe that kind of sits over to the side where all of this is going on.
I have to say I'm amazed that you don't have this all plotted out. So you help me understand here. So you're sitting down, you're kind of, okay, in 1971, I want to focus on this. And this is how Nick and Carter are going to, I mean, how does that?
No, not even that. So, okay. So the first series, the Nick Williams Mysteries, is book 1 through 32. It starts in 53. It ends in 67.
Okay.
There's a jump to 70.
Okay.
Where this new series that I call The Adventures, so that I don't have to write a mystery in every book. It can be more romance or just things that happen, just stories.
Yeah.
Because by this point, there's enough momentum to where it doesn't have to all be about a mystery, right?
So you're taking these characters and you're crossing genres with them?
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, I've got romance, I've got mystery, and I've got just plain old adventure, thriller.
Oh.
I would love to do, just as a side note, I've do you remember in the early 70s when every cartoon character was suddenly in outer space?
Kind of. I was a little young then.
Well, the Jackson 5 went to outer space,
Yes.
Scooby-Doo, the
Okay, yeah.
Pussycats went to outer space. There was like, I've been wanting to do like a Nick and Carter in outer space, which would be a very silly kind of like
Yeah.
just as ridiculous as Hanna-Barbera in their whatever they were doing.
I'm guessing a
So
lot of drugs. That's how they came up with a lot of stuff.
yeah, right, exactly. That made me like it was all a dream. But so that would put the science fiction part in there. But although there is one kind of science fiction-y thing that I have done, and I'm not giving anything away by saying this. In the contemporary series, which takes place literally the day I start writing is the day the book starts. So the last book I wrote in the contemporary series started on August 29th, and that's because that was the day I sat down to write.
Okay.
So in that series, there's basically the people who have inherited what Nick and Carter left behind. And one of the things I have is that this is the science fiction part. Underneath Nob Hill, and I don't even know how to explain it. It was in my mind, it was just there. And I was like, well, okay, I can see that it would be theoretically possible. They built this multi-story underground bunker. They've basically excavated half of Nob Hill to install this like bunker that theoretically the city doesn't know about. And in fact, there was a reference to that in the Veterans Day book where Nick is like, we really do need to pay taxes. We've developed all this land and we're not paying property taxes on it. And Carter's like, yeah, I know, but we'll just let whoever inherits from us take care of that. Like, I don't want to deal with that. I've dealt with a lot of shit in my life, and I'm not going to deal with that.
Yeah.
So that's still like an unknown factor, even in 2020. So that's the science fiction part, because of course, in a place that is literally laced with seismic monitors, there's no way anybody could excavate anything that people wouldn't know about. Mm-hmm. So, because basically, Nob Hill is like 5 miles from a fault line, right? A major fault line. So, anyway, so that's my science fiction part. But yeah, so it cross genres, but basically adventure, thriller, romance, and mystery.
Yeah.
And there's romance built into all the books, essentially.
Sure.
It's about a relationship. It's about these guys and and how they live together and what they do together and how their lives evolve.
Yeah. I just, like I said, so you're a pantser.
I hate that word, but yes.
Okay. Well, okay.
Yeah. No, I know that's the word. But to me, what it is that when I said earlier, there's a universe that's sitting, well, probably more like over here. A universe that's sitting over here, and all I just do is kind of like put my head in. I'm like, hey, what's going on over here? My entryway into it is the newspaper. That's actually the way I get in there, because I read what is going on, and then I think about, well, what would Nick think about that? And then I can suddenly kind of see, then I get into it and I can see it.
Huh. That's an interesting process. I'm a pantser, but I don't even think I go that far with it. That's interesting. So you read a paper from whatever you're studying, and you kind of poke in and say, okay, what would Nick think about this? And then you just off to the races.
Yeah, that's how I get in. And then when I get in there, Nick is kind of like waiting, like with his arms crossed, like, like.
Oh, those damn characters.
Yeah, they're waiting, just like, okay, we're here waiting for you.
Yeah. Tapping their foot and going, excuse me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something to do. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, we've talked about your books now for about 46 minutes or 40 some minutes or whatever. One of the things that we wanted to get into is Texas. You're from Lubbock, Texas.
I am. The South Plains, hub of the plains.
Hub of the plains. And, we talked a little bit about, and you wanted to kind of explain the difference between East and West Texas and how that integrates into your books.
Yeah. So in my contemporary series, one of the characters is basically me. So he's from Lubbock, and his name is Eddie. and he's in a relationship with this guy named Whit, who's from Marshall. So Marshall is at the end of I-20, just before you're going to cross into Louisiana.
Okay.
So it's East Texas, and that's actually a place where I spent my childhood, parts of it, because my mother, when I was growing up, basically, my mother lived in East Texas, my dad lived in Lubbock, and we would go back and forth. I grew up with my dad, but we spent a fair amount of time actually in East Texas, mostly on Caddo Lake, which is actually right divided by the state line right there.
Okay.
So Whit basically grew up in this area that that I knew from when I was a kid, but I didn't ever really live there. Although I've lived there as an adult, but I didn't live there as a kid. So mostly the way I know the difference between East and West Texas is because my mother has lived all over Texas. She's lived outside of Texas once for like a year when she lived in Shreveport, which is barely outside of Texas. Shreveport might as well be in Texas. So she like lived in Marfa when she was a kid. She was living there when they filmed the movie Giant. So she has these great stories about Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor and all that.
Yeah.
She's lived down in the valley, which is down by the border. She lived in Lubbock when she was married to my dad. She's lived in Dallas, and she's lived in, and she now lives in Austin. But she's also lived in Northeast Texas at the lake. Though that's what we called it, the lake.
The lake.
But anyway, so the main way I know the difference is my stepmother, who was born and raised outside of Lubbock, has like her great grandparents were homesteaders. You know, the first people to ever own this land, literally, because the Apache and the Comanche wouldn't live there. It was too. There was no way to get water. It wasn't until you could drill that people were living there, where they could drill wells and irrigate. Anyway, so she grew up there, and she hates East Texas with a purple passion. Just thinks it's gross and everybody's hicky and blah, 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 blah. And of course, people in East Texas kind of feel like West Texas, like, who are those people? We don't, how is this even the same state?
Yeah.
And there's, you know, Dallas and Fort Worth. Dallas is in Dallas County. Fort Worth is in Tarrant County. That county line, that's the dividing place between East Texas
and West.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you drive from Dallas across on the south end, and go into Fort Worth, as you're coming around on the west side of Fort Worth, you really get it, because you're coming out of like this one part of the world, and you come around this curve, and then suddenly you can see all of West Texas open up in front of you. It's amazing, actually. But they are in Fort Worth and Dallas are like might as well be 100 miles apart, but they're only like 15 miles apart.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're two completely different cities. And then, of course, you got Austin, which is its own place.
Yeah.
Then you got Houston, which is its own place.
Mm-hmm.
And San Antonio, which is its own place. And San Antonio features in my current series because Whit, who is a retired football player, NFL player, has, because of Nick and Carter, now owns the mythical or fictional NFL franchise in San Antonio.
Okay.
And in fact, right at this, as we speak, they're living in San Antonio because they didn't want to fly back and forth from here to there with everything going on with COVID. Which is the last book I wrote in that series, happened back in August, and was all about them moving there and things that happened as they got there.
The only comment I had was it'd be nice if Texas would get a professional football team.
I don't know anything. Okay, so first of all, I know nothing about football.
Okay.
Period.
Well, I was just.
Fortunately, I have a brother and about 100 readers who are football fanatics.
Uh-huh.
So everything that I write about the Matadors is the name of the team in San Antonio. Everything I write about the Matadors is based on the team structure, and their playing schedule is all basically picked up from the Texans.
Okay.
Whoever the Texans has played this year is who the Matadors are playing.
Okay.
So the Texans exist, but we never interact with them because they kind of need to be over to the side, which I think some people in Texas would actually prefer. But the other thing is that Texas, with this fictional team, will now have 3 franchises. that's the golden standard, right? Florida has 3 franchises. California has 3 franchises.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you get to 3, that's when you've like made it, right? And that Texas would be such a large state with only 2 franchises is apparently this major, massive thing that people talk about. And San Antonio is the obvious place for the 3rd franchise.
See,
So,
in my opinion, up here we have the 2 franchises that count, which would be the Packers and the Bears. But everything else, I'm not sure. They're all like everybody else. They're just expansion teams.
true. Well, I can't really argue with that because I don't really know anything about football.
Oh, somebody will argue with it.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Ask me poking some bear somewhere.
I'll write a bunch of text dialogue where Whit is talking about something he did when he was playing or something they're doing with the team, and then I immediately send it off to my people, and I'm like, okay, did I get any of this right? Is that how this works? And I'm getting better. The last time I did that, I was like, oh yeah, no, you're right. I'm like, wow, that's amazing, since I know nothing about this at all. Whit is sort of based on Gronk. Rob Gronkowski.
Okay.
And kind of a cross between Rob Gronkowski and Tim Tebow. So he has Tim Tebow's backstory. If Tim Tebow were to come out as being gay, that would be Whit. That's Whit. But it's a little bit more intense than that. So, because in Whit's backstory, he's known as being the other Tim Tebow. That's basically how people refer to him in the media.
Okay.
Because he has the same kind of approach. He's very in the old days, before he came out, he was very Christian and very pronounced about it. His father's a mega church minister in East Texas, so that's where that's coming from, and which provides lots and lots of really interesting plot stuff, as you can imagine.
So obviously, his dad must be a billionaire because that's what happens with those mega churches.
Well, well, 2 things happened to his dad. One is he got murdered. And the second is that basically the kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, the cartel that built itself up around his church absconded with all the money.
Oh.
And so at this point, Whit's mother has taken over the ministry, which of course is also creating a huge scandal. Because now there's a woman, and there are some women megachurch ministers.
Oh, sure.
There's like 2 that I know of, but in their church, it's caused kind of an issue and a kind of a schism. And she's just found out that they're also out of money. She's out of money again. Okay. So we'll find out what happens with that. But in fact, actually, the plot point in this last book was that because they're not meeting in person, so she was doing kind of a Zoom sermon, and in the middle of it she just announces that they've become an affirming church. And so what affirming means is that they openly welcome lesbian and gay members. And that's actually the plot point that starts everything that happens in the book I just wrote back in September. So so there's a lot of interesting things about that, because his parents basically start off having a storefront church in Marshall that's like meeting in like an old abandoned grocery store or whatever. Sure. And then build it up into this big, huge, gigantic organization. And now the organization is basically falling apart. So we'll see what happens with that.
Oh, they all fall apart and then somebody else takes over.
Yeah, no, right, exactly.
When I was young, it was Jim and Tammy Baker, I think, were the big ones. And then I always wanted that T-shirt where it said, "I ran into Tammy Baker." Faye Baker has. Do you remember those? It's got the makeup stains on the shirt. Yeah.
I kind of want to. I mean, the more I get to know Whit's mother, because they're characters, they're real people. Right. I want her at some point to because Jim and Tammy would have been happening they were falling apart right at about the time that Whit's parents were starting their church. But I want at some point for his mother to come out and basically like give her opinion on Tammy Faye. It hasn't happened yet, but I keep like, come on, just give me a little something.
Yeah.
But she's very stubborn. So she's like, I'm not here to be your monkey. I'm like, you're right. You're just here to be in my book. That's right.
Isn't it just horrible when characters don't cooperate?
Yes, like always.
Yeah.
This is uncooperative as actual real human beings.
I get into fights with mine all the time. Then they do something stupid and they say, okay, fix it, buddy.
One of the things I like to talk about these books is that each one of the series that I write basically has a primary narrator. I mostly write in first person.
Okay.
So the Nick Carter stuff is all Nick. And Nick is a very pronounced presence in my life. I don't know how else to put it. Then in the Whit and Eddie stuff, it's Eddie, which is me, essentially. But in the Daytona Beach books, I have 5 POVs, and they're all in, I never know what the word is. It's all like Ronnie thought, and Ronnie said, and Ronnie felt. It's not I thought, I saw. But I finally figured out it was Ronnie who was kind of basically spearheading the whole campaign to get this story out. It's the best way I can put it. Ronnie, who's basically, Nick is in charge of their stories and Eddie's in charge of these stories, but Ronnie's in charge of the Daytona Beach books. Mm-hmm. And he's one stubborn SOB. If I met him in real life, I think I would like him, but I would also probably keep a little bit of distance from him.
Yeah. So do you prefer first person versus third, or why?
Yes, because it's just, you just get in there, you get in somebody's head, and you're just like off and running, and they're like, brrr. And in that third person, what is that called? Whatever that POV is, you have to like go down in and kind of sit on top of their head and watch what they're doing. And
third person limited.
Yeah, right. Third person limited. Right. Yeah. Right. You can basically sit on top of them and watch what their eyes are seeing and listen to what their ears are hearing, and basically watch what they're thinking, but you can't get down in them.
Right.
And getting down in them for me is really easy. But what it's also allowed me to do in the Daytona Beach series is I have 5 POVs, so that means I get to see the story from all these different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And it includes, so there's Tom and Ronnie, and then Howie, who is he must be 20, and he works for Ronnie. He was Tom's first client. And then there's Marvine, who is Tom's secretary, and she has Marvine's actually a lot of fun because she has her own running commentary about everything, and she's always kind of like walking around being pretty judgmental about everything, but in a really fun kind of way. Mm-hmm. And then there's Alice, the woman who works for Tom and Ronnie as their maid, essentially, who lives over in 2nd Avenue, which is what the black part of Daytona Beach was called at the time. And but is being mentored by Mary McLeod Bethune, who, if you're not from here, you wouldn't know who that is. But Mary McLeod Bethune was the woman who started Bethune-Cookman University, which is the historical black college here in town. And she was a force of nature. She was also very good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt when FDR was president. Mm-hmm. Well, through that part of her life and until she passed away, because she died before Eleanor did. And that the benefit that had for here was that during the war, there was the Navy took over the airport, like they did in most of the little towns that were by the coast, so they could do training and whatnot. But there wasn't really anything else happening here. So Mary McLeod Bethune gets on the phone and calls Eleanor and is like, "You got to get something. We need something. We need money. We need people coming in." Mm-hmm. So she turns over and says to Franklin, "Okay, you got to do something for Mary McLeod." And what we ended up with was a big, huge wave, the Women's Auxiliary Volunteer that were part of the Navy. A big, huge wave base was set up. And it became kind of famous because there's all these wonderful pictures of the waves doing formations up and down the beach, because the beach is very flat. Yeah. And so it's like concrete. You can walk up and down on it. And so they would they brought a lot of money into the economy. which was great, and we really needed it because Daytona didn't do very well during the Depression.
Yeah.
Never really kind of came back until during and after the war.
Right.
Because it was so tourism oriented, you know. But anyway, so Alice is great because she's over in that part of the world that none of the other characters have access to. In fact, I wrote in this book that I'm writing on, there's a scene where Ronnie and Howie have to go over there to interview somebody about a crime that's about this murder. And Ronnie basically, and it's all through Ronnie's eyes. Ronnie's basically like, I come over to this part of town and I realize that I don't belong here, that nobody wants me here, that the people are afraid of me, and I don't like that, and I want to know more, but I also feel like I'm violating this kind of safe space, although he doesn't talk like that.
Right.
But this kind of safe space that is basically, because of Mary McLeod Bethune, is very safe, like much safer than any other part of this part of Florida, which is true. Compared to the counties around here, Volusia County was a pretty safe spot, relatively speaking, if you were Black. There was a lot of other stuff that happened around, but not here, and particularly not in Daytona Beach. Although there's some exceptions to that, like we have the mainland side and then the beach side, because there's a river that runs between the beach and here. And on the beach side, you couldn't live there if you were Black. You were also not really allowed to be over there unless you had papers, so to speak.
Okay.
The police would stop you and ask you what you were doing, and then take you back over if you didn't have a reason to be there. Which mostly meant if you didn't have a job working as a maid or working in a restaurant. But for the most part, being able to look at the world through Alice's eyes is actually, it's very interesting to me, because every time I think I understand what's going to happen, there's a little curve that occurs that I would never have occurred to me. And that's when I really know. We can joke about like characters or their own individuals, and blah, blah, they're just as real as anyone else. But in writing with Alice, and not about, but with, it's become clear to me how much I don't understand about the world she lived in. Fortunately, I have some beta readers who are Black, and in fact, one of my beta readers, her father knew Mary McLeod Bethune. So there's a connection there. So those people have really helped me make sure that I get the language right for the time, and also for the attitude and the position that Alice would take. But one of the fun parts too about this story, and then I'll kind of wrap that up, is that Tom helps her establish and Mary McLeod Bethune suggests she does this kind of as her mentor, set up a school for adults who need to learn how to read and write. That was in the 40s. That was a really big deal, really, really big deal in Florida, about getting there, because there were lots and lots of Black folks in their 40s and 50s and 60s who really didn't know how to read or write because they just had never gone to school. So anyway, so Alice gets involved in that, which will also provide, plot points as we go forward. So I think I've told you just about everything there is to say about any of this.
I really doubt that, but no, it's been really interesting. I just listening to what you've said, your process is very interesting to me. And how you came up with your storylines, and I am thoroughly intrigued that you have the one series that is going from 1953 to 2008, and then you have all these interweaving stories, and it's all the same universe and everything else. That is totally cool. I mean, that was really cool. From my perspective, I'm like, again, this happens to me just about every show. It's like, shit, that's brilliant. Okay, cool. I mean, that is really neat to me. I love that premise. Well, and I especially love that you've written 72 books and you're a pantser. It's like, oh, my hero. But
if I plotted, I would be still in the middle of like book 2. Because what I had to do basically was give up all of that.
Oh, we're gonna get some hate mail on that. Some outliner is gonna be like, oh, that's not true. I can write faster than you can. Okay. Yeah.
Well, that's probably true, but that's not the way my brain works. So What I
Yeah.
need is I need an idea that unleashes itself and then fills itself in, which is what I've got. That's what's going on.
Right.
You know, and in fact, I'll just say this one thing about that. This book I'm working on right now that has taken 18 months or longer, maybe more like 20. Part of the reason it has is because it's the most plotted book I've ever done. And to say that it's plotted, no plotter would ever recognize what I mean by plotting. But it's the most organized book, and it has like, I have a specific thing I'm doing, which is outlining trial procedure so that I can use it as a reference going forward. And that's actually what has made this be so long, because if I had just sat down and let everybody loose, I would have been done within 3 or 4 weeks easily,
Sure.
you know, if not shorter. So, but it's also added some, I would say it's added a little bit of spice to the story that I wasn't expecting. But anyway, hopefully I'll be soon. Hopefully I'll be done really soon.
Very cool.
We'll see.
Very cool. We are running up on an hour here.
Well, I feel like I've just blah, blah, blah'd all my way through this. I hope there's been something fun and interesting about it.
I think the whole damn thing was fun and interesting. I
Yeah.
really is with you. I enjoyed the conversation. So,
You know, I really enjoyed the way that you present stuff and the way that you talk about the art of writing and how it's individual, it's not prescribed, it's going by the seat of your pants when you're really in the middle of it, even if you're plotting. And
I feel like there's a whole bunch of there's a whole bunch of people out there that prescribe to a certain when they're starting out writing. I think there's a whole lot of people out there that have, you know, courses and this and that, and they tell you you're going to do this and this and this and this and this, and they try and put you in a box. And I really think this industry is not worthy of a box. I think you're outside the box. You're going to figure out how to do this. You're going to figure out how to do that. And one of the points that I am trying to make with some of the podcasts, especially somebody who's thinking about writing a book or something like that, just do it. You know,
Right.
you will figure it out. You don't need to pay $5,000 for somebody to show you how to do this. You can read enough articles. You know, if you have some basic English and, you know, you want to work on your actual writing, that's fine. But if you're trying to figure out how to do plot points and everything else, write the story, then just refine it. Yeah. And you do it, you figure out your own process.
Right.
And there's so many successful authors that, you know, when they come down to it and they think about it, it's like, yeah, I don't really use, you know, 5 acts. I use 3 acts, or I use 9 acts, or, you know, I read Save the Cat 15 times and I use 19 acts or whatever it is. You know, it doesn't really matter as long as you keep the story rolling, you know, and as long as you write something that's interesting and keeps the writers, or not the writers, the readers' attention. Well, the writers too. I mean, it's really hard to write a book that you don't want to read, but
Right.
you know, and you know, I think that part of it makes books unique and special on how they write it. I really do, you know, and I think knowing how the author writes and knowing how the author kind of thinks about this kind of stuff, when your fans see stuff like this podcast and they're looking at it and go, oh, okay, this is Frank Butterfield. No, oh, this is, you know, something might click, you know, and they'll get more, you know, deeper endeared to you is what I'm hoping. But, you know, or I'm just making up shit and babbling on. Who knows?
Well, no, I think you're right on. I think that the structural stuff is important for certain people. That's what they need. But I also think that a lot of people, if you get right down to it, because this is what I faced, is you have to be willing to fail. And if you're willing to fail, you can do anything, really. Right. But particularly when it comes to writing, like I have a high school friend who is steadily going through all of my paperbacks and orders like 5 at a time directly from me. And so he comments every now and then about the stories. And we had a teacher, our junior English teacher, Mrs. Joy Kilgore, rest her soul. She died right after I think we killed her. She died like the next fall. But I'm like, every now and then I'm like, you know, Mrs. Kilgore is rolling in her grave because of all the things I'm doing wrong. And he goes, yes, I think that every time I read your books, he's like, you're doing all this structural stuff wrong. there's misspellings, because that's one of the things about my stuff is I do not care. I try as much as I can to make sure I get it right,
Mhm.
but I'm okay with there being problems. I'm okay with it being 97% good
Yeah.
in terms of grammar and spelling. But there's sometimes where things fall through the crack, and I don't have an editor, for better or for worse.
Okay.
But I can't imagine working with one because I'm too crotchety and I'm too independent. Um, and also, I just don't know how I would do it, to be honest.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there are people I know who have a whole lot of editing people that they're working with, like for plot, for continuity, for grammar, for spelling, for punctuation, for all, and that's perfect and it's wonderful and it's great. And I support that. So everybody has their own way of doing it. But what I
Right.
really love is that there's a voice like yours where you're out there saying, look, just do it and fall flat on your face and let everything go to hell in a handbasket, because you'll learn so much about what you're doing through the mistakes you make.
The one thing that I learned is that you can write a really shitty book that's a good story and then rewrite it and
Oh, yeah.
re-release it. And you can do
Right.
that 9-10 times.
Right.
And you know what? Who cares?
Right.
You know, I mean, that first book, your first book always sucks. Your first book is the worst one you'll ever write. Second one will be the second worst, and then it just progressively gets better. But you can go back and rewrite those. You can go
Right.
back and you can retitle them and do something completely different if you want. Or you can just leave them there and say, hey, it's my first work. Good luck. Have fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's all about the story, and it's all about your journey, your own personal journey in this industry.
Yeah, exactly.
Is what I think.
Yeah. Well put.
I'm actually going to call the show to an end. I think we're done.
Yep,
And
feels like it.
Frank, I think you need to come back on.
I'd love to.
So
It's
at
a
some
lot of
point
fun.
in time, we'll get that lined up. Get a couple more books out or whatever. What's that? 6 weeks for your writing schedule. But I do appreciate you coming on, and I still am in awe. 72 books, that's a lot. 73 books, whatever it is, not counting your short stories and anthologies and everything else that you've done. You are a hell of a writer, sir. But with that, I want to say to everyone, thank you very much for listening to the DIY Writer Podcast. Special thanks to Frank Butterfield. And if you would please subscribe to my YouTube channel or whatever app you happen to be listening to this podcast on, go ahead and follow me. I appreciate any support you can possibly get or I can get. And with that, I want to tell everybody have a great day and keep your chin up. Bye-bye.
Please hit the subscribe button. I get a bonus for every subscriber, and I only need 1,506 more to become a full-time paid employee. Help me, please.